Hey, how's it going? I'm Josh from 91 Tech, and recently I was sent the Samsung Galaxy Z Fold 7, and I gotta say, so far it's been a pretty awesome smartphone. It's incredibly thin, the display is big and impressive, and more than anything else for me, it feels like a fresh new experience. Really unlike anything I've gotten from a smartphone in a really long time. And that makes sense. Really going back to the first iPhone in 2007, what makes a solid smartphone really hasn't changed all that dramatically. The home button would eventually disappear, and bezels have slimmed down significantly, but beyond that, we're still looking at more or less a very similar device to the one Steve Jobs introduced on stage all those many years ago. Smartphones certainly have been further refined every passing year, but they've also gotten to a point where they're so good already, it feels like there's much less headroom for them to continue to improve. In the early days, we saw far larger leaps year to year as technology was rapidly evolving, but at this point in the 2020s, it feels like every major flagship tends to look the same every single year. Enter foldable smartphones, really first beginning with the Samsung Galaxy Fold in 2019, which was an absolute disaster and nowhere near ready for market when it first hit the hands of reviewers. But now we're on to the Fold 7, and things have come a really long way, to the point that there's very little downside to getting a phone like this, at least outside of the price point, but there's a lot to love here. I mean, who wouldn't want a phone that at any time can expand into a mini tablet? Not only is it potentially quite useful in some situations, but it's also just so cool, so novel, and such a genuinely new feeling experience. Using the Fold 7 for the last little while has gotten me thinking more than I ever have before about the future of smartphones, and whether or not it's fair to say foldables are finally at the point where maybe we can even call them truly great and worth the hype. And while I wouldn't recommend buying the Fold 7 for basically anybody, simply because I don't think having a folding phone is generally going to be worth $2,000 US, I would still say, for those who are willing to spend the money on a phone like this, I do really think it's a great option. The Fold 7 feels like you're holding the future of smartphones in your hands. It's really quite something. But just because it feels like the future doesn't necessarily mean that it is. So today we ask the question, is the future of smartphones foldable? Going into this, I think there are 4 core issues with foldables that have held them back over the past 6 or so years from really breaking into the mainstream. I do think right now it is totally fair to call these devices great, much more so than ever before, but that doesn't mean they're perfect. So let's look at those 4 big issues that have historically hindered foldables. Number 1 is the price. These phones are just too expensive right now for your average consumer, and they've always been that way. Number 2 is durability. These phones are innately going to be less durable than a non-folding smartphone, though they've come a long way since the days of the first Galaxy Fold. Number 3 would be form factor and design. If you're making a folding phone, you've got a lot to balance. How thick and large the device is, the crease in the display, and so on. This is another thing that has improved significantly over the years, and the Fold 7 in particular is absurdly thin. And finally, number 4, implementation and practicality. And this can go hand in hand with the design, but for me, this mostly amounts to how well optimized the software and entire experience is, and really how useful these phones can be. Without the right software being built around the folding feature, the entire thing will feel lacking and unnecessary. How practical is a foldable phone? Of these 4 main problems, I do think the biggest is absolutely number 1 with the price, and it's an issue I don't see going away anytime soon. If I was to give a 5th issue, it would be that Apple hasn't made a foldable yet, but in fairness, Samsung has been making them for a long time. This is their 7th generation we're talking about, so regardless, we've had a lot of time to get used to foldables and see what they're capable of. Really, until either of these phones are way cheaper, like half their current price, or at least until Apple makes one, foldables will never be truly mainstream, at least in my opinion. They probably will pick up more popularity over time, but at the moment, they fit in a more luxury niche of smartphones, for people who can afford them. Of course, Apple making one would still keep them firmly within the luxury realm, as no doubt it would at least cost $2,000 if not more, but I think you would still see them garner far more popularity very quickly. As it stands right now, however, and this has to do with the practicality factor, there's very little reason to go out of your way to buy one of these unless you have the expendable income to do so. It's like a nice brand new Mercedes-Benz versus a Honda Civic. Sure, the Mercedes might be more fun to drive and a whole lot flashier, but they'll both get you from A to B, and if there are any potential issues down the line, fixing that Mercedes is gonna cost a whole lot more than the Civic. Plus, odds are you'd be keeping the car for about the same amount of time anyways. There are some use cases where foldables are exceptionally helpful, but they're really not that common. I'd say the biggest reason to get one of these outside of the novelty would be for the sake of productivity. If you're someone who maybe works from their phone a lot, on the go, perhaps the busy businessman type who spends all day writing emails and multitasking with a bunch of different apps, this sort of phone may actually be worth the extra $1,000 over another flagship. It is essentially like bringing a mini tablet around in your pocket, and unquestionably, it could boost your productivity in the right situation. But for the vast majority of users, the benefits will be mainly superficial. You get a larger screen to browse the web, watch video, consume content, play games, and whatever else. Plus, and let's be real here, this phone is cool, it's flashy, it's a great point of conversation. Most people still have hardly even seen a foldable smartphone, much less have actually used one, so bringing this around to a party will probably get at least a few people interested in trying to fold and unfold it themselves. There's a level of novelty here that no longer exists in most smartphones, and while it's not as powerful or mind-boggling as the novelty of early iPhones and the like with their magical touch displays that can be controlled by just your finger, this is still something that feels genuinely new and cool, even though it actually has been around for a while. And perhaps somewhat ironically, the novelty only really exists still because foldables haven't yet broken into the mainstream. As soon as they're priced the same as every other phone, were that to ever happen, people will get used to them very quickly, and then they'll no longer become a big topic of conversation. Teslas used to be like the coolest thing ever until everyone and their mom got one, and now suddenly knowing someone who owns a Tesla really isn't a big deal. But we're probably a long ways from that happening. It's hard to see foldables ever really getting cheaper because they don't need to. They work well enough as a luxury product at the moment, and there's frankly not a lot of competition for Samsung or any reason to push them to work to drive the pricing down. There's really not a lot of flagship foldables in general. You've got a plethora of Chinese foldables to be sure, but then there's like the Galaxy Z Fold, the Pixel Fold, and there's really not a whole lot others past those two. Then there is of course the Galaxy Z Flip, which is in a bit of an odd spot at about half the price of the Fold, costing a similar amount to a bunch of the best flagship smartphones on the market. It still absolutely is something I would consider a luxury smartphone, but lesser so than the Fold due to the pricing, but it also doesn't bring a whole lot for said price. While the Fold is basically the size of a single smartphone that can turn into a mini tablet, the Flip is about half the size of a normal phone that can turn into, well, about the full size of a normal phone. Maybe this is controversial, but that doesn't really seem all that useful to me in any practical sense. I mean, it's still super cool, don't get me wrong, I think all this tech is really cool, but there's a lot less benefit than the Fold, unless you're in a very niche scenario where a regular size smartphone is genuinely too large for you to bring around for some reason. But still, the Flip is pretty cool, and in a lot of ways I can see it being far more appealing than the Fold is. There's something about that satisfying clamshell flip phone design that just can't be beat, and considering how long it was gone for with the advent of modern smartphones, there's also a certain nostalgia element at play here. Look at those Motorola Razr phones, for example. Those things were absolutely made with nostalgia at the forefront. Whichever way you put it, the Flip might be neat, but it's got very little practical utility compared to any other flagship at around $1,000. And in fact, it has a bunch of downsides that come with a foldable phone that you wouldn't get on your typical Galaxy S25 Ultra or whatever else. Durability, for example, whether it be a Flip or a Fold, is always going to be a worry. And while I'm confident Samsung's probably done a lot to make these things as tough and capable as possible, you're still looking at an inherently more fragile smartphone than one that doesn't fold for the same price. And when you're not really getting any practical utility from a phone like this, it becomes basically a pure fashion statement, something to show off, something new and novel and not a whole lot more. And there's nothing wrong with that, don't get me wrong, I'd probably love a phone like the Flip for a while at least, but is there really much reason to buy it over a different device? In any case, the Flip really isn't the subject of this video so much as the Folds. The whole point of foldables, from their onset, at least conceptually, was to bring around a normal size phone that can turn into a tablet at any time. And given how smartphones have only continued to get larger and larger every year since Samsung's early phablets took the world by storm, something like this just seems like the most obvious path for the future of smartphones. And with the Fold 7, I feel like we're closer than ever to achieving that ideal form factor. The fact that this phone is as thin as it is unbelievable. Folded up, it's about the same thickness as my iPhone 15 Pro Max, and it has a very similar physical footprint. Unfolded, it's so darn thin that it can barely even fit that USB-C port on the bottom. It's crazy, and we've probably about hit the limits for how thin these things can actually get without removing that port entirely. This phone is amazing, but it's still $2,000, and even if I liked it enough to the point that I wanted to buy one for myself, I'm an iPhone user. I'm stuck in their walled garden ecosystem, and while it's technically possible for me to leave at any time, it's simply not convenient. If I were to buy a foldable phone, I would probably far prefer to get one from Apple, but they don't have one. And if I had to guess, we might still have quite a ways to wait before they actually make one. It's honestly pretty crazy that Samsung is already on the Fold 7 before Apple even makes a single one. I understand why Apple was hesitant initially. Apple tends to wait until new tech is near perfect before implementing it themselves, and while this can be frustrating at times, it does help them maintain the reputation of creating consistent and reliable products. They're not always perfect, I mean look at their AI rollout for example, but generally speaking, they're pretty good at what they do. And when you look at the absolute disaster that was the first Galaxy Fold, it's easy to see why Apple wouldn't bother rushing something to market. That phone needed at least another year or two in the oven, and never should have seen the light of day considering the state it was in. And even a few generations of Fold onwards, durability problems were still persistent, even if on the whole Samsung has worked really hard to improve their design, display, hinge, and everything else. And they've gotten really far. The Fold 7 is awesome. And that's the thing, Samsung has improved everything to the point now that with the Fold 7, the formerly major issues are either gone entirely or in the very least are a lot less major. This phone does still feel fragile to me, but it's light years ahead of what that first generation was to be sure, and I'm sure it's a whole lot more durable than I would actually expect. It's just hard not to be automatically careful when holding a phone that can get this thin and costs $2,000. It feels fragile, even if it really isn't, although any way you put it, it's still going to be far more delicate than your typical non-folding phone. So that's issue number 2, durability. I think it's fair to say it's been mostly dealt with at this point. It ain't perfect, but it probably never will be. Issue number 3, form factor. Well, I mean, look at how thin this thing is, or how the crease is barely even visible when looking at the screen dead on. It's not perfect yet, and the screen doesn't feel nearly as good to me as the glass display on the outside, but it's still pretty darn solid. So I'd say the issue with the design is practically dealt with. This is pretty good. Then there's number 4, implementation and practicality. And this one's tougher. Implementation will vary depending on what you're doing. Some apps don't automatically resize if you close the fold, for example, so you have to actually restart the app altogether to get it on the outside display, which is a little bit annoying. The hole punch notch feels kind of in the way to me. I don't know why they didn't put it in the corner. It can easily cut into your games or even video, and while there are some workarounds to hide it in settings, or you can orient the display differently maybe, it still feels like a bit of an oversight to me. It's too bad those invisible selfie cameras never really seem to pan out. Overall though, I think the implementation is pretty solid, and the practicality of a device like this is absolutely there for those who want or need it. I just don't think too many people will ever really actually need it. Sure, it's a great device for productivity, but double the price of another flagship great? Highly dubious. The use cases for a phone like this do exist, but really this is mainly just a luxury smartphone rather than one truly worth its price point. So for point number 4, I'd say we're getting there, but the practicality is still questionable. And that just leaves issue number 1, the pricing, and I just don't see this one ever being solved as things are right now. A phone like this is going to be expensive to make, so unless Samsung were to sell them at a loss, and there's zero reason they would ever do that, they're always going to be too expensive for the average consumer to consider. You would need it to suddenly become far more practical or mainstream for that price problem to disappear, and if a foldable iPhone were to come out, that would probably be the biggest boon to foldables possible, because then a bunch of iPhone users would get them, and that would increase word of mouth, and you'd see probably a lot of Samsung users start to get them too because more people are talking about foldables. But at this point, it's tough to gauge whether or not foldable phones are really the future. I think all we've really determined is that they're certainly not the present quite yet, but they could be the future, in my opinion, if Apple jumps on board and/or the prices magically come down significantly. But unless one of these big manufacturers were to exclusively offer folding phones as their sole option, I really don't see foldables breaking out of this luxury smartphone subset that they found themselves in for the better part of a decade. And maybe that's okay. There's nothing wrong with them just coexisting with regular smartphones. Heck, if anything, it just gives us, as the consumer, even more variety and choice, which I think is always a positive. The truth is, without something major shaking up the smartphone landscape, I don't believe foldables are the future. I do believe they'll only continue to get more popular with time, but it's hard to see them becoming the go-to option. Not when you can get a phone that does everything the Fold can do at a far cheaper price point. Well, everything except Fold. Particularly in a lot of countries where more budget-oriented smartphones are far more popular than in, say, North America. I think coexistence between foldables and regular phones is the most likely outcome, at least within the next 5 to 10 years. Past that, I really have no idea. Not that I have any idea anyways, but typically when a new sort of technological revolution happens, it does tend to take the world by storm, so the landscape could look wildly different by then. Look at how quickly things changed after the first iPhone, or even the recent AI boom with ChatGPT coming out. In only a couple of short years, AI has been slapped onto anything and everything, and it's improving at an unprecedented rate. It's very possible something new comes along that either replaces smartphones outright, or changes them to a point that they're completely unrecognizable to what we have today. But if that doesn't happen, I do think foldables will continue to get more popular and better, but coexistence still seems to be the most likely future in my opinion. And I think that's a good thing. Hopefully at some point Apple brings their own competitor to market, and this tech will only continue to be refined and improved, but I gotta hand it to Samsung. They've made a pretty great smartphone right here, even if I still personally probably wouldn't spend $2,000 on it.
And so with that, I think we're right about done here. Just thought it would be fun to talk about the future of smartphones for a little bit today. And I'm very curious here, what do you think? Do you think foldables are the future? Do you think they're just a passing fad? Or is the answer somewhere in between? Will we continue to see foldables and regular smartphones coexist in the future? Make sure you let me know in the comments down below. Oh, and here's a big question for you. What would it take for you to actually buy a foldable, assuming you don't already have one? If you found this video interesting, please hit that like button and consider subscribing for more tech content just like this. We do have a Discord server, great community over there, and huge shout out to the channel members. Thank you guys so much for your support. And really, thank you all for watching. I'm Josh from 91 Tech, and I will see you all next time.